Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Brian Trasher from Laws and Sausage TV with another weekly political rundown. Although we've experienced several seasons of weather within the span of 1 week here in New Orleans, today actually feels like spring, so I decided to break out the seersucker. After all, we're not only the Queen City of the South, but we're also the northernmost capital of the Caribbean. And speaking of the Caribbean, the Cuban government made a historic move this week by electing the first president not named Castro in nearly 60 years. Fidel Castro became the leader of Cuba after his revolution in 1959, first serving as prime minister and then as its president until he retired in 2008, passing the torch to his younger brother, Raul. 57-year-old Miguel Díaz-Canel, Cuba's former national vice president, was confirmed as its new president on April 19th. Díaz-Canel has been a party activist since he was in his early 20s and gained popular status in his hometown because he often rode his bike to work and was just as comfortable wearing jeans as he was wearing a suit. He rose quickly through the ranks of the National Party and was groomed by the Castro brothers themselves. Although the Cuban media attempted to create the appearance of a horse race, there was virtually no one in the political upper class in Cuba, or within the United States government for that matter, who thought that Castro's successor would be anyone other than Díaz-Canel. I traveled to Cuba this week to be sort of a fly on the wall to hear and see the reactions of the locals in Santiago, Cuba's second largest city and hometown of the Castro brothers. Much like in the United States, there are some Cuban people who follow local politics and some who do not. People who work for the government, which is the majority of the employed population, do not usually openly discuss politics, especially with outsiders. The few privileged who are allowed to own private enterprises tend to not even pay attention to politics because it's the safest way to not form an opinion about the government. Those same entrepreneurs generally would not dare speak publicly about the government because anything perceived as negative, or as they say in Cuba, counter to the revolution, could result in them losing everything, including their businesses and homes. It is generally the youth and the people with not much material possession to lose who seem to feel more comfortable giving their honest political opinions. Now, this is a generalization, but it's the quickest way that I can explain my perception of the current political climate in Cuba based on conversations that I had. Most people over the age of 40 tend to still be loyal to the revolutionary government and its mission to sustain what is clearly not a sustainable socialist state. People between the ages of 25 and 40 seem to understand that communism has failed their generation and does not offer much hope for their future and the future of Cuba. There is a shortage of jobs in Cuba, and the few that are available pay unconscionably low wages. The disparity between the haves and the have-nots is clearly illustrated in the country's dual currency system, which offers one set of currency for locals and another set for the elite and for tourists. This makes many essential items unaffordable for ordinary Cubans and puts a roadblock to any kind of upward mobility. The dual currency situation is expected to be one of the first possible reforms the new government will attempt to tackle in its first year. It's rather complicated, of course, because any drastic changes to a currency system runs the risk of causing inflation. Several years ago, President Raul Castro allowed cell phones and internet access onto the island for private citizens, at least for those who could afford it. In what may have been an unintended consequence, the Cuban people were able to see how other people in the world lived compared to them. This caused feelings of anger and frustration and led to many questions about why the same opportunities did not exist in Cuba. No longer being able to blame the collapse of the Soviet Union, the government now tells people that the U.S. embargo against Cuba is solely responsible for their impoverished status. While many news websites are blocked, there's still enough information on the internet for people in Cuba to realize that what they're being told is not always the truth. In fact, I was up late one night drinking some very fine rum with a Cuban government official who will go unnamed, and we started talking about the blockade. They say blockade, we say embargo. I said almost half jokingly that maybe once we can ease the recent political tensions between our two countries, then maybe there could be a negotiation that would ease the embargo. She started giggling and said, "Oh no, please don't get rid of the blockade." When I asked why, she realized that she had perhaps said something that she was not supposed to. I assured her that nobody else was around and I would appreciate if she would finish her thought. So she reluctantly said, "Well, If there was no more blockade, then I am not sure what excuse we would give people when they complain about the economy. Many of the arguments for keeping the embargo that I have heard, mostly from Cuban Americans, is to put pressure on the Castros. Well, in over half a century, that strategy has not seemed to work. And after that rum-infused conversation with a government official, I'm now convinced that the best way to hurt the current regime would be to take away their ability to excuse their own failing economy to the people. But that's just me. Many people are curious about how elections are held in Cuba, especially in light of the fact that much of the world does not consider the process to be fair and truly democratic. I was actually down there in December when the voting process started. It had been pushed back a few months because of Hurricane Maria. Basically what happens is that you start off with local assemblies, sort of like neighborhood caucuses, where people will go and listen to candidates who wish to be delegates at the provincial assembly. The province in Cuba is like a state here in the United States. So those delegates are chosen, and then they go to the provincial assembly, where they elect another person or persons to attend the National Assembly, where the president is ultimately selected. Well, while the initial voting might give people a feeling that they're part of the democratic process, I don't have to tell you that when the process advances to the upper levels, the people have absolutely no say in what happens. First of all, there's only one recognized national party. And while they have the authority to nominate more than one candidate, that has simply never happened. It didn't happen this time either, as the National Assembly only put forth the one name of Miguel Díaz-Canel as presidential candidate. It is not a coincidence that only a week or so before that, Raúl Castro himself stated that Canel was his personal choice to succeed him. And on April 19th, the National Assembly rubber-stamped that choice, and Canel was sworn in as president. It almost reminds me of another political party here in America that lets people vote in a primary system, but at the end of the day, it's the party-appointed superdelegates who actually choose their nominee. While the election of someone other than a Castro is a historic moment in Cuba, most of the commentary about the direction of Cuba not changing much are probably true, at least in the short term. While some immediate changes and reforms are inevitable, what many people don't realize is that there are still half a dozen or so 80-something-year-old guys who fought side by side with the Castros in the revolution that still hold positions of power in the National Party, including Raúl. By contrast, Miguel Díaz-Canel was born 1 year after the revolution took place. Now that may be irrelevant to his loyalty to the revolution, but he definitely comes from a different generation. And until these old guys who started out in the Sierra Maestras with the Castro brothers and Che Guevara die off, I would not expect any radical changes. I've also been asked about Cuban attitudes toward the United States. Well, that depends on if you're talking to someone from the government or just a regular person on the street. When you ask someone from the government, they usually say something like, it's very difficult right now, the tensions are very high, and that's actually true. When you ask someone on the street, they almost always have a very favorable attitude toward the Americans, and most wish they could live in America. Almost every single person I spoke with has family in the United States. As for what they think about President Trump, that also depends on who you're talking to. When he was first running for president and was first elected, many people seemed to like him because he was a rich businessman and a television star, and that probably intrigued them. After he reversed travel policy to Cuba last summer, it greatly affected the tourism industry in Cuba, which hit a lot of everyday ordinary people in the pocket pretty hard. They took it personally, and they generally don't seem to like him anymore. That's not across the board, but it's a majority opinion based on my small sample. Now, I don't have all the answers for Cuba, but the one thing that I do know is that we have to create relationships with people down there. You don't have to agree with someone or even like them to have a good faith relationship with them. So how do you do it? You start by finding something in common. And I've always felt that the best way to understand someone is by studying their culture and teaching them about yours. Cultural exchanges go back almost to the beginning of time. And as someone who has experienced a lot of Cuban culture, I highly recommend it. I especially recommend the rum. Too bad President Trump doesn't drink, but here's to hoping that he can find something else in common with Cuba's new president. Well, folks, that does it for another weekly political rundown. Please like and share this video and subscribe to the Laws and Sausage YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.